So today, we're going to talk about kind of 6 things. First thing we're going to go over is why students struggle. We're going to talk about some typical interventions that we might see in any classroom in America or worldwide. We're going to go through kind of a direct instruction approach that we've seen at our school to be successful about helping kids to actually take notes. We're going to talk about teacher best practices. So some things, even if you don't use this particular approach to teach, what are some things to do to help scaffold students who need some support with taking notes. We're then going to go through a learning progression, so talk about how some of the language comes online from the earliest learning all the way up through the end of high school. And then we're going to finish up today talking about note-taking and assistive technology. So the first place we're going to start is why students struggle. So if you are actually taking notes today, you're going to look for this particular page that has the URL on top that has demands, automaticity, demands, and EF, the big 2. Quick note, we accidentally stapled these things in the wrong corner, so it's a little bit backwards, so it's the upside down side. So just be aware of that. So it's the one with the demands, automaticity, demands on EF, and the big 2.
All right, so my name is Victoria Brickinen. I'm a speech-language pathologist at the Howard School. I work with the high school students. If you are confused about why your packet's stapled backwards, that's my bad. I was really tired at 5 o'clock on Friday. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is in note-taking that our students are struggling with. So when we ask students to take notes in a classroom setting, we're actually putting a lot of demands on them. We're asking them to hear what's being said and remember. We're asking them to listen out for understanding. We're asking them to organize spatially not only what they're seeing on the board, but then what they're putting on their papers. We're asking them to form letters and to spell correctly. We're asking them to copy from afar, to write or type quickly. We're asking them to deal with unfamiliar terms and make decisions about what to do with that when they come across something that they're not familiar with. We're asking them to not only know how to abbreviate, but that they can and should abbreviate when they're taking notes. We're asking them to adopt the point of view of the speaker and make decisions about what it is that they think the speaker thinks is important. We're asking them to relate to past knowledge and experiences, think of questions that they might need to ask, and then develop a plan to follow up. I mean, our students need to decide what it is that they're doing when the bell rings and they leave at the end of the day. Those are a lot of things that we're asking them to do, and we simply say, grab out a piece of paper and a pencil and take notes. There's 13 demands up there. That's a lot of things. And not only is it a lot of things, we're asking them to do it all simultaneously, which really what we know about that means that they're just shifting back and forth from task to task. So when we're talking about taking notes and capturing that information and getting it on paper, automaticity is a friend. In order to be successful with that capture part, where they're just simply getting notes down on a piece of paper, we think that they need to be successful at quickly writing or typing, reading quickly, effortlessly spelling, and quickly connecting with prior information. If you're successful with these things, then you're going to be really great at getting that information onto your notes, be it on a computer or on a piece of paper. But what we know about that, of course, is that just that capture, just getting it on the piece of paper, is really surface level information and learning, and what we want them to do is to go a little bit deeper with it, and we'll talk about that a little later on. What we also know about note-taking is that in a note-taking task, it's placing a huge level of demands on executive functioning. There are a lot of different models of executive functioning out there. There can be some with as few as 3 domains and some with as many as 30 or more. This one right here that we're looking at is about 10, and it's adopted from Dawson 2015. It's a hybrid kind of model. What's important to note, I'm not going to go into all of the different domains, but it's important to realize that a breakdown can occur in any of these domains and can affect the note-taking process. What we also know about executive functioning is that it's moderated by working memory and processing speed. And that when we're doing note-taking, those 2 moderators are taxed insanely, like a lot. So what we know is that they're really the big 2. So if you have a low working memory capacity and slower processing speed, it's taxed during a note-taking session, and then also you're having breakdowns in executive functioning, and so it's contributing to that lack of automaticity that we're seeing affect students' note-taking. To give you a little bit of an example of how that plays out, the next slide, you don't have to try and copy anything down. It's just an example of what some of our students are seeing in a typical high school biology classroom. So they might see and hear something like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are considered macromolecules because they are composed of multiple units of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So my kids with working memory deficits, they're stuck on the end of that sentence, right? They're getting carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and they have no idea what happened at the beginning part of the sentence. Their brains are only holding on to that immediate last piece of information that they heard, and they have no idea what happened at the beginning of the sentence. So that's leading to a lack of understanding. We're missing details. We're not getting the big picture. They're really not understanding what's happening, and they're having those incomplete notes. If you were to hear that sentence and you are one of my kids with slower processing speeds, you're getting the first 3 words. You're hearing carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and you're still trying to decode and understand what's happening there, and you have no idea what's coming at the end, right? So again, you're seeing the lack of understanding. You're missing details. You're not able to create those main ideas, and you're missing kind of the big picture and what's happening in the class. I think what's important to note about this is that at any given time in any classroom, regardless of if you work with a specialized population or not, you have kids with all of this going on, right? You have some kids that are getting the beginning of what you're saying, and you have some kids that are getting the end. And so there's this mismatch in what's happening and what's being understood. So what we need to do is figure out how to work together with our students to help create those deeper understandings and fill in some of those gaps. And with that, I turn it over to Scott. Sorry.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about typical interventions and why we think they don't really work. So as a little exercise, how many people actually took some notes on that first section? So fantastic, great. What I'd like you guys to do is go ahead and turn your papers over. Don't look at them right now. Don't look at your phones if you ever took a picture of one of the slides up there, so we're not going to use any resources. And I want to just a show of hands, how many people think they can name all 13 demands? How many people actually got all 13 demands written down? Ooh, 1 or 2. Oh, you guys are fast typers, so you're automatic in that typing. How many people got 10 of those 13 demands written down? 5 or 6? How many people just got 1 or 2? All right, even though you only got 1 or 2, how many could name 2 or 3 of them? Maybe? Maybe 4 of them? Maybe 5? So what we know right now is in order for you actually to encode that information, we've had a surface level learning experience where you've been given information. Typically what happens is teachers expect, okay, they've written it down, they're going to go home, what are they going to do? They're going to study their notes, and they're going to magically get it, it's going to appear in their brains, and tomorrow they're going to have all 13 demands down. The answer to that little statement right there is, I would guarantee you in any typical classroom in America that is not going to happen unless someone has some sort of eidetic memory and they actually remember everything that they've been given. So let's do a little bit of an exercise with this. We're not going to do a full, what I would do with my kids at this point is I'd actually scaffold in time where they can work on some peer learning, right? Some collaborative learning approaches. But I'd like you to just go ahead and turn to a neighbor or two and see if you can get a few more of those demands down right here. We'll just do it for a minute or so. So fill in some missing gaps of information. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of a pause here. Thank you very much. So again, in my classroom, I'd give them a little bit more time to do that. We wouldn't do it in 30 seconds because we do need some time to encode some information here. And I'm going to scaffold that as an actual skill. So actually how to work with partners to fill in missing gaps of information. Next thing I'd like you guys to do is for all 4 of these things, so for the demands, automaticity, demands on EF, the big 2, I want you to pull out 3 or 4 key terms. These can be tier 2, tier 3 words that if you actually took them out of your notes would lose all meaning whatsoever. So, and I'll give you an example because it's the one everyone picks. If you took that word automaticity out of the notes, you as a student would be looking at it and I'd say, I have no idea what this is saying. So go ahead and pick out just a couple of key words or things that you think might be key words and put them over here. All right, fantastic. So again, we're going to move forward. In my classroom, I would spend a day or 2 actually working on this with students, right? Being able to identify key terms, key vocabulary, being able to then work on getting definitions for those when we don't understand, things like that. Next thing I'd like you guys to do is I would like you to create a summary. Now, I have some specific rules about my summary. So now that we've done the key terms and we have how many topics here? 4 small topics. What I'd like you to do for the summary is I want you to write 1 to 2 sentences. For the purpose of today, just jot down a quick sentence. I'd like you to try to incorporate something from each of the 4 bullet points, and I want you to use as many of the key terms as you possibly can. So that's kind of the challenge for you. Again, 1 to 2 sentences, as much information from those 4 bullet points as you can, or something from each bullet point, and as many of the key terms as you can. All right, go ahead. We'll take 1 minute to do that now. All right, finish up the last few words that you're working on. Put a period at the end of that sentence. All right, thank you. So this is another skill we would specifically actually scaffold for the students and take direct instruction time to actually teach them how to do, right? How to take information and actually summarize it. So how to compress the message. Last thing I want you to do to get started is I want you to now create a how or a why question. It's important, not a what question. We're going to push higher order thinking that is answered by the summary. So your how or why question that you're going to create right now is one that is answered by the summary. By your summary, yes, that you created. All right, again, I'm going to move forward, so I apologize. We're just short on time, so we're not going to spend a long time. Because I just want you to get the idea of what we're doing to scaffold some of these note-taking as we're talking today. We're pushing how or why questions, because what do we want to do with our kids? We want to push them up Bloom's taxonomy. We want to push them to higher order thinking. But really what this is an exercise in doing is really starting to codify all the information that was actually presented in the notes themselves. So let's do what we did before. Go ahead and turn your papers over. Put the phone down, don't look at it. And I just want you to think, so this is our being kind of metacognitive awareness of ourselves. How many people think now, if I asked you how many words that you wrote down for your 13 demands, how many got more of those demands actually onto their paper? Just a couple of you. How many think now that you actually have a better chance of getting a couple of more words out when I ask you what are the 13 demands than you did about 5 minutes ago? All right. How many people think that through writing that process and going through that, they have a better understanding of what our goal is for you to learn through today's 1-hour session? Right? Because here's what our goal is for us today. And I love that the room's filling up because I think there's big telling that we struggle with how to teach kids how to take notes. And our real goal today is actually to see if we've got some strategies that we can use on a day-to-day basis to actually teach our kids how to take notes. So we're going to shift now to typical interventions. So if you flip your papers over, you'll notice now, what do you have all filled in for you? You've got all the notes, right? So what do you think I'm going to not ask you to do right now? Don't take notes. They're there for you. You don't have to worry about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to free up those processing parts of your brains right now to just pay attention to what we're doing. So you don't have to worry about taking notes. They're all there. If you want, you can jot something to the side or highlight if you think it's important or you like it or whatever, but that's it. So it's just a real attentional process right now. And afterwards, we'll work a little bit on the summary. All right, so typical interventions and why they don't work. Typically, what we do for students for notes oftentimes is we might provide them the actual PowerPoints themselves, right? If we do a PowerPoint lecture, this might happen beforehand, right? We give them, or we provide the PowerPoints and we erase some words, right? So we say, hey, listen, you're going to attend and you're going to write a word here or there and fill it in. We might talk about teaching the kids how to keyboard better. Or we might work on their handwriting. A lot of recent research suggests that actually handwriting has better ability to codify information into the brain than keyboarding is. But so you might work on handwriting skills where they're going to actually improve their automaticity with actually taking notes by hand. Or those students that keyboard and love to keyboard that need the computer bypass, we might work on their typing speed. So again, how do we increase the pace at which they can take notes? We might ask the students to come better prepared, right? Give them anticipatory sets. Have them do some background reading beforehand. Have them get those PowerPoints beforehand and say, look at it before you actually come into class. We might work on their organization method, right? Where we actually give them the Cornell Notes template and we say, okay, or 2-column notes and say, here's your main ideas over here. Here's where you have things here. Or to organize, this is where you do your bullet points and move over and all that kind of stuff. We might actually have them try a smart pen, especially kids that struggle with reading and decoding so they can actually listen and record the lecture at the same time. But oftentimes what we do, and especially in a high school classroom, is we just say practice, practice, practice. The more you take notes, the better you're going to get, right? Oh, by the way, on the side it says, can you repeat part of the stuff where you said all about the things? And I think most of our kids are probably doing that every single day in the classroom. The problem is our classrooms aren't like that. Our classrooms are cerebro or neurodiverse. We've got students in every classroom that do have poor working memory. Their capacity might be not as strong as the person that's sitting next to them. We've got students that have slow processing speed, right? They're thinking of the very first thing you said, and they're missing the rest of the entire lecture. You got students that have ADHD. They're great students. They can get everything, but, squirrel, they're outside looking at that thing that's down the hall and not paying attention to what you want to attend to. They're attending, just not what you want them to listen to. We got students with dyslexia that as they're trying to take notes, they're trying to figure out how to spell words correctly, right? And so they're using their spell check while you're going on. Well, what are their brains actually focused on? Decoding and encoding, not actually on processing what's going on in the lecture. You got kids that have dysgraphia, right? So if you were saying, hey, let's all handwrite, or in some classes where you don't allow laptops, these kids, even if they got it down, they're not able to read it back to them because it's scribbles and it's just non-coherent. And then you get kids that are anxious. It's great that they're in there, they can take notes, but they're so worried about that note that's being passed, the Facebook post that's over here, something else that's happening in their lives, that they're not even paying attention to the lecture anyway because their amygdala is overriding any of their neurosystems to actually get the information in. This is what we see. And honestly, this is probably comorbid in a lot of, we know this, right? You're seeing a lot of comorbidity with all this stuff. So then we say, okay, well, let's just talk about neurotypical students. And how many people have heard this, right? When you ask a neurotypical student who doesn't have any of those difficulties, well, what did you do to prepare for the test? I looked at my notes. Well, what does that mean, right? How many people have heard that from a student? I don't think these work. And I think my colleagues would agree that these don't work. It's not that they're bad strategies. It's not that these things aren't important to actually do. I think they are. But I don't think they work because there's an expectation that the students are fluent, right? There's an expectation that the students have prior knowledge that they can pull out the information so they know what you're talking about. There's an expectation that if we can just increase their automaticity, increase the fluency of which they take notes, that all of a sudden they're going to understand actually how to take notes, how to work with those notes, and how to be better note takers. And we have this assumption in the classroom that all students are going to respond neurotypically. We're here at International Dyslexia Association. I think we are all speaking to this crowd of people that understand that all students aren't going to react with neurotypical interventions, and sometimes we need deeper, more meaningful interventions. I'd also make an argument that if you're doing good interventions for kids that are cerebrodiverse, that's going to be really good for kids that are neurotypical as well. Good teaching is good teaching. Why we think that these things need to be scaffolded is because, in our opinion, these things are all passive interventions, right? When we're talking about what you do beforehand, speeding up, things like that, we're actually not teaching kids how to take notes, decode notes, and process notes, and do things to get it from the actual lecture and into their brains, where we want it to be so we can have more meaningful conversations. So we believe that we need to work on direct instruction with our kids. We actually need to explicitly teach our kids how to take notes, but more importantly, not what they do in the lecture, it's what they do after the lecture. Because they're not going to be able to become automatic, all of them. They're not going to actually, we can't fix the automaticity for every one of our students. So what do you do afterwards for the fact that you missed something in the lecture? That's more important to us. So here's what I'd like you to do. We're going to work on summary skills really quickly, 30 seconds, because again, we're going to go forward. What I would like you to do is compose a summary, so that you're getting an idea of how we kind of scaffold this, right? So one of the powers of using this template, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is we can break it down for the students, and we can work on one portion at a time, or one note-taking skill at a time. A really important skill for students is how to summarize, right? How to actually take information and compress to pull out the main idea. So we might actually give them notes that are completely filled in, because all we're doing today is we're working on summaries. So we use the curriculum as a lens to get the kids to actually work on more meaningful note-taking skills. So what I'd like you to do is write a 1 to 2 sentence summary. That's it. No more than 1 to 2 sentences. Includes something from each of the 4 main bullet points. 1, 2, 3, 4. Typical interventions. The Cerebrodiversity one, the neurotypical students, and why typical interventions don't work. And as many of the key vocab terms as you can. So 30 seconds, go ahead, go. All right, you guys get the idea, right? So what we're doing is we're taking that time for actually kids not just to listen to the lecture, but actually to start to encode the information. So we're taking that time to work on summary skills. What you then might do, so we're not going to do this, is you might do a pair share activity. I love pair sharing. You get that collaborative brain because, you know, especially if you've got a kid over here that's got working memory deficits and a kid over here that's got slow processing speed, seeing only the end of the sentence, seeing only the beginning of the sentence, what do you get when you put them together? Someone who sees the whole sentence, right? So pair share is great for this kind of activity, right? Have them actually evaluate the summary. Is it a true summary? Does it actually follow the rules? And then evaluate whether that how-why question fits the summary, because if the how-why question is important, can they actually change that summary to make it work, or vice versa? Can we change the how-why question to hit the summary? So how do we actually do this at Howard? Right? And the argument of what we're doing. What we're doing is we have an approach that's we call it CPA. In our notes, we're actually working on this page now, so it's a new page. You'll notice that at this point, we've got all the notes, right? And I have an exemplar model summary here, right? So we're modeling for the kids. What's the one section that I'm missing? How or why. So this is, you know, maybe we're working on creating good questions, right? Having our kids actually understand it's not the what questions that are important. It's really those higher order thinking questions. We're not trying to just give you information so you can memorize everything. We got the little Google thing that does that for you. What we're trying to get you to do is understand why is it that we're talking about this stuff. So how many people have used Cornell Notes or know what Cornell Notes is? And all right, good, the majority of you. Really what you're seeing is a Cornell Note template. We just adjusted it for Howard, and I think it's a great model to use. What we're trying to do with our Cornell Notes is we have a concept of moving our students from being passive note takers to being more active note users. So moving from that idea that we are going to just lecture to you, you're expected to go home, you're expected to look over your notes, you're expected to do whatever you're going to do with your notes, and then you're expected to come in and know what it is the next day or a week later when you take that test, right? that's something that we think does not work for students. So we've got to teach our students actually how to modify, use, and work with your notes, just like you would do in the collegiate classroom, right? So my college years were spent in, like a Starbucks. I don't think we had a Starbucks at the time. It was back in the day. And it was spent with friends of mine that were in classes where we would say, hey, what was that lecture all about? What was the main idea? What did you get out of it? Let me check your notes. Let me look at my notes. And we spent that time doing a lot of peer collaborative work. We think that is a great model for helping kids to learn. So we use this approach. It's a three-tiered thinking approach. We call it capture, process, apply, where the capture is just what happens during that lecture, during that day. The process is how do we go back and look through those notes and actually have active strategies to pull information out of those notes. And then apply, how do we actually go and then do something with those notes that's going to help codify information. It really is all about exposure and consolidation. Right? Just like vocab, when we're teaching a new word, we know that it takes 70 or 80 exposures in order to get that word into vocab. If we're lecturing on that same thing and we're in a science classroom and we're doing tier 3 words, it doesn't take any less just because the word is something like carbohydrate. It takes just as many times. So we want to expose those kids to that word as much as possible and get them to use it right off of the bat. This is not without challenges. It takes time. We're often pressed in this society with actually getting through a pacing chart of information that we have to do by a certain standardized test date that we've not got to get through. Unfortunately, it takes time to teach note-taking, and that's time back right down to being a kindergarten teacher, because a lot of the skills necessary to be an effective note-taking student in the high school are actually back down to those younger ages, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We believe this is research supported. Not that there's actually research on our particular methodology. That is not what I'm suggesting here. But a lot of the recent literature, when it talks about thinking and learning, this is one I just found the other day and read. Some meta-analysis of 228 papers that has a model for thinking and learning where they're talking about surface, deep, and transfer. It's what we know about kids. The first exposure, they're not going to get it. They're going to have surface understanding. The more we expose them to something, they get deeper understanding, and then eventually they can transfer their learning to something else, right? But what they're saying and suggesting is, in all this literature, is that we have to have acquisition and consolidation at each level of learning. Well, if you take that model, that's exactly what has to happen with notes. We've got to have some way, not just acquiring the information verbally from the lecture, but actually somehow consolidating that as a process that we're actively teaching to our students. So this is just to show you an example. This was before we did a CPA intervention with a class at Howard, and we gave them the students the template, and we said, all right, just take some notes, and this is typically what we got, right? You get just that bullet point straight list, nothing else. They got as much information as they would. That's on a 1 hour lecture or whatever, 50-minute lecture or whatever it was. That's what they got. No consolidation whatsoever. We'll come back to that. Inherently, we think this is also differentiated. This is why I said you've got templates online, because if you do it right, you can give different students different things. Some students, like if you're printing it out in a classroom, if they've got dysgraphia, you might actually choose to give them a template that has got more line spaces or grids or things like that. If you've got kids that write really small, maybe you can put 2 in a thing. If you've got kids that like to doodle and draw around, you can give them this one. Whatever working for whatever style note-taking that they have. You can give online versions for those kids that actually take notes on a computer, right? So, and that's typically what we do is we have one template that's online, and we give them all on the computer, and we ask them to take notes that way. So how does it work? Capture really is inherently about repetition. It's about codifying that through lots of inputs. So the first exposure, we're going to lecture the information. We're going to give them a second exposure where we're going to have them fill in gaps of missing information. This is where we actually are going to use things like a textbook, use things like the internet, use things like each other to actually teach them how, when you miss something in the lecture, how do you fill it in? How do you find that one person in that classroom who actually got everything down on paper that doesn't understand a word that's being said, but can help you fill in the missing gaps because you didn't get anything written down, but you understood everything that's being said, right? How do you work through that? This is where we might, for some students, provide teacher-provided notes. How do we actually scaffold it and differentiate it for different kids? Then we might teach our kids how to organize their notes, how to actually highlight important details, how to push out, making bullet points and actually doing a hierarchical bullet pointing system? How do we teach them to look up words that they don't understand? So what are they doing with their notes? I want you to notice something on this, right? That how big was the first exposure? Just the lecture. It's just what they got at that moment. In reality, it doesn't matter if you are someone who gets one word down, you are someone that gets 50 words down. That's not the important point. Let them do whatever they're going to do during that lecture. Because some kids, they can only get that one word down. Fantastic, get that one word down. It's what they do afterwards that actually is the important step to actually get the note-taking solidified and actually understand and remember. We then might start thinking about process level of thinking, right? Pulling out key vocabulary, summarizing the capture, how to actually sequence and summarize, using the key vocab, summarizing those major concepts. We then might have them create those how-why questions, pushing higher order thinking, right? That's why we're doing how-why. We're going to keep pushing our kids to think critically about why things are important. Really what we're doing here is we're giving them 6 or 7 exposures right there to that material because they actually actively have to read the material, work with a partner, fill it in, and do something with it to get the information into their little brains. Then we might actually have them apply the information because what's good about note-taking if you're actually not using it, right? And that's not all about test-taking. We might have them do a lab. We might have them do some homework. We might have them do a project. If we give them a test, we might actually give them an open notes test, where what we do is we ask them the how-why questions that they've created themselves. We might have them create the test using their how-why questions. We might ask them to study for a test, but at this time we're going to actually explicitly say, okay, now you've got those vocab terms that you pulled out. Those are the ones that we go create those flashcards for. Right? You've got those how-why questions. Those are the ones that you're going to prepare your short answer essay things for. These are the things we're starting to make predictions now on what the teacher actually thinks is important, which is a huge skill later on when they get to college, right? Trying to figure out, what does the professor want me to know? We might ask them to write a paper, right? We now have some structure that we can actually pull out of these particular notes to actually generate good quality papers. Generate questions that they have that they can do an independent research project on. Predict material that we think that teachers might think is important. Whatever we do, now's when we say this is the art of teaching, is that we make authentic experiences for those kids. We don't just expect them to take the notes and learn from it. We make those experiences that they can actually get that information and get it in. So if you remember this, I'm just going to show you after a 2 to 3 week intervention that we worked with the kids, we are getting stuff like this, right? Where they're actually in the same lecture time, right? Our class periods didn't change. We're actually starting to see kids, there's still more work to be done here, obviously. We've got to work on organization and things like that. But we're seeing kids actually doing summaries, getting overall summaries so they actually get the gist of the main idea of an entire lecture, which we think is super valuable. Last note on CPA. One of the things we've also found that's been very powerful when we started introducing this is we could use it not just on lectures, but we actually used it on decoding expository textbooks, where now kids actually have a strategy they can use to read a section, summarize that section, and so they use their note-taking template to actually take notes from an expository textbook. And then, again, I think we're all brilliant educators in here, so modifications for your own pedagogy as necessary. So at this point, we're not going to do this because I think for time expediency, we're going to move on. I'd have my students, after giving that section, let's create a how-why question right there that is answered by that summary, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to make sure that everyone understands that process of making that how-why question.
Good morning, I'm Joseph Walsh. We've talked about getting you beyond the mentality of thinking that capture is the most important thing and beginning to think in terms of processing and application. There are some things that we have to do as teachers, both to facilitate capture but also to promote processing so that it happens with some depth and some purchase over the kids' memory. So here you're going to learn about teacher best practices. This is a template, and you can see that it says how do teacher best practices help us support our students, so you're free to take notes there if you like. Here are some of the best practices I'll break down one by one, but I want you to see all of them before I begin. It's quite a few things. And what I'm suggesting is that we have to be disciplined as teachers in terms of the things that we do from our end. It's very easy to say, well, I'm going to lecture and it's on the kid to have to get everything down. But actually, there's a great deal that we need to do in order to make that possible for kids. And so here are some of the things that we believe work well. It can be very important, particularly if you're using assistive technology, to make the slides, handouts, and lectures available to them online. This has benefits in terms of allowing kids to preview and get sort of that anticipatory set, but also reduces some of the anxiety about capture. And I think you may recognize that that's often what kids are experiencing about the capture is a great deal of anxiety about, am I really going to get it? Am I going to miss something? Is this going to go past me? We think that students don't necessarily know what an accomplished set of notes really looks like, and so it makes sense to give them model notes occasionally so that they can see, oh, that's what I'm targeting, that's what I'm aiming for. And it's also a good chance for metacognitive reflection because a student can look and say, okay, compared to this exemplar, my notes were strong in this particular area, but they need some work in other ones. And it also is a way of cueing students about the relative importance of concepts. Not everything that we say in a lecture is of equal importance to everything else, and students have to do a lot of work, and we can really cue them in, do a lot of work from our end to help them understand what points are meant to be most salient, where transitions among topics occur, and so forth. That leads to chunking information. This is one of the hardest things, to my surprise a little bit, for students to do. You have to model for students when we have transitioned between topics, and you have to say how the logical flow of the lecture follows some sort of structure. We need to model processes for students to learn how to do content chunking. It's also something that helps facilitate memory. So instead of having that long laundry list of notes that Scott showed as the first, the sort of the pretest for our intervention, in fact, you can see that kids are learning to chunk and make the notes that they're taking match the topic that they're talking with. It's helpful to use accessible language. So if kids are working on note-taking as a specific skill, don't make the language load more than it needs to be. There are times when you do want to use higher level language, but recognize that parsing complex language while capturing notes is something that may overwhelm processing, and what we're trying to do is get kids increasingly to be able to process at the same time that they're capturing. This also makes new vocabulary salient, so that when a kid hears a new word or a higher level word, it stands out. Part of that as well is emphasizing transitions. So students don't necessarily know when you have moved from one part of the argument to the next until you have gotten them used to noticing that and seeing that it's important. So you emphasize transitions in order to preview upcoming information, cue to the sequence and the development of your thought. It reinforces saliency, and it's another thing that helps to reduce anxiety. Students know, okay, we've now moved on to the next thing. I'm seeing that there's some progress through this lecture, and it's going to end before too long. They want to know that. That's seriously is an important thing. Is, you know, how much more of this do I have to endure? Is something many kids want to know. You want to pace according to students. So it's altogether easy to say, well, when you get to college, you're going to have to take notes at a certain speed, and so I'm going to get you used to that. Don't do that. Let the capture to be separated from the processing, and give the processing its due. Allow time as well for self-assessment as to whether the notes that were taken during capture were really complete. Give note takers a break. This is taxing. What we're asking kids to do, I hope you can see that there's a great many skills that have to be online simultaneously in order for this to work, and that is fatiguing. So if you give breaks, you're allowing kids the ability to sort of incrementally increase the time that they can attend during a lecture. It allows some of the processing to occur while the capture is still going on, and eventually you want them to reach the point where they are able to make certain decisions about processing during the capture. Reduces brain fatigue, and it also allows you to have a moment for peers to be used as resources. We think allowing students to work with partners is important. Note-taking could be, if you wanted it to be, a solitary activity. But if you think about it, many students benefit from, and will benefit in college, particularly from having to work with a study buddy or being part of a study group. So allowing there to be a social dimension to note-taking is something that I think is important. It's good for encouraging the peer-to-peer interaction, showing students how to be good partners for each other. You also want the students to rely on each other increasingly and not just on the teacher. And so you model the use of peers as resources and get used to that being an expectation for future success in workplaces. Be selective with the visuals. You do want to support students relating words to images. You want to use images that support visual memory and the ability to visualize concepts and ideas. You want to use them to signal transitions and to signal chunks. So those are the things that we need to do. This is the step away from passive intervention into more active intervention, and I'm suggesting that some of that is a matter of disciplining ourselves as teachers to be doing those things instead of just standing up and presenting something and expecting students to keep up. The next thing I want to talk about is a learning progression. What do you do when too much information is coming at you to be able to possibly get down? You may be experiencing that now. We're hitting you with quite a bit of stuff. And it's true that there are times when a student isn't necessarily to be expected to get everything. And that's all right. What you have to do is make resources available. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through a resource that we've made available to you. Has anyone in this room ever done what I've done, which is spend a lot of time making a really clever resource and giving it to a kid, and then the kid doesn't use it and you wonder why? That's happened to you too? So some of that is on us to teach how the resources are to be used, right? So we're not only talking about note-taking, but note-using, and this is a very important thing. Now, there is a philosophical prelude to all this. There are some things that we definitely believe. As it should be pretty clear by now, note-taking is not stenography. You are not a court reporter. And stopping with teaching capture is slighting students. We believe that the actual capstone skill that we're working toward is paraphrasing. So note-taking is a good thing to do, but the thing that we really want our students to be able to develop in the long run is the ability to critically assess and represent others' thoughts and words. You have to do that to succeed socially. You also have to do that to succeed academically. And what I'm going to show you in this progression, the developmental progression behind this, is that that's sort of the end of the line. That's the ultimate thing that we're aiming for through note-taking, not just note-taking itself. So we believe that there's a developmental progression. This is real SLP thinking, right? We think in terms of what is the order of acquisition of particular skills. Not everything comes online at once, we know that, but there is often an order in which these things happen. And so we're going to talk you through developmental progression through note-taking skills that leads to mastery. And paraphrasing, our vehicle for that, is the CPA, the Capture Process Apply strategy in note-taking. Now, there is a caveat here. We're presenting some claims that are original to us in the course of doing this. If you go out into the world and try to figure out, well, is there a developmental progression about note-taking and paraphrasing skills, what you will find is that the evidence base is strikingly incomplete. And so often what you find yourself doing, if you think about this sort of thing, is you have to go it alone and use your intuition and use your experience with students. And so that's what we've done, is filled in the gaps and the details in the evidence base through our observation and intuition. So what that means is you're about to see work that's very much in progress. We are working on this. We don't know that in another year, well, in another year we're going to believe this. I don't know, in a couple of years, it may be that we have found other things, other ways of looking at it, and so stay tuned. All right. By the way, if you're thinking, well, I don't teach high school, that's not a problem because the learning progression extends to pre-K that we're going to talk about. There are essential note-taking skills that you actually can begin working on with young kids. So here's the progression. We believe it begins with listening, learning how to listen and listen well. From there, kids need to learn how to repeat. And if you're going to take a picture, wait, because you'll see the whole thing. It's not going to go away. I'll make sure. Kids need to learn to sort as a way of working on categorization, and categorization skills are very important to note-taking skills. We need to teach kids to anticipate what's coming next in the argument, or what am I supposed to do now to be prepared to take notes and to use them. Relevance and reference are really important. Having kids recognize, oh, for a particular point I'm trying to make in my paper, this is the thing in the notes that relates to it. That takes doing. That's not something that comes to kids automatically often. We have to explicitly teach that. Shortening the message or compressing the capture and the input is something that kids learn to do, though relatively, I think, late because it's on the way to being a paraphrasing skill. Summarizing and then paraphrasing, that's the progression that we think that we're finding. And as I said, this is preliminary and it's original to us, so don't assume that we have got this all the way nailed down yet. Now, what I'm going to do, you have resources. Scott showed the tiny URL earlier. I'm not going to take you through each one of these things in exhaustive detail. What I want to do is show you how we think about it. And from there, you have the ability to then go back and look at the resources that we provided and make sense of them at a better pace for your needs. So what we do in each of these things is say, what's the skill? So for listening, and this is something we can have little kids doing, the skill is picking up the signal, right? Knowing that there is something going on that you need to attend to. Usually for little kids, it's the teacher's voice. Getting them to attend to that message and doing it longer and longer, and eventually beginning to anticipate and listen out for cues. So typically the way that this goes in a classroom is after getting kids to filter for teachers' voices, we teach them things like whole body listening, and then strategies for attending comes later on. It's not necessarily easy to attend, and so we have to learn how that's done. In the long run, what this leads to is listening out for things, knowing what to listen out for, and knowing how to process and write simultaneously to the listening. So you see the way that this is composed here, right? We have the skill, then we say what we think is the order in which that skill develops through particular language milestones, and then what we're aiming for. Each of the slides is built that way. Repeating is getting the message right and learning to quote. You want kids eventually to be able to write papers where they're using quotations from other people. And this is a good way to begin to discern main idea. It develops by verbatim repetition that eventually turns into recasting what someone said, not repeating it verbatim, and then reformulating information, and that's the sort of thing that leads to reported speech and quotation in papers. Sorting words and then concepts around main idea and detail and pinpointing take-homes is a very important skill to be able to learn. Categorization has a great deal to do with note-taking. It also has a great deal to do with note-using later on, because often what you're trying to say is, oh, this thing is like that. This thing is related to this other thing. These things belong in a category together. These two categories can be associated with each other. Sorting, beginning with objects and words and assignments, keeping calendars, desktops, prioritizing things, and sorting main idea and detail. That's a lot of executive functioning work that's also related to language development work. And eventually you get categories through observational data. Why was there a cricket? Is that telling me to stop? Is that you?
No. It's just should I stop? No.
That was kind of, or maybe it's just that boring. The insects have come out to register their displeasure. I don't know, you know. I'll keep going. Anticipating is about knowing what else I need to know for a task. A teacher gives me so much, what else do I need? And that's about saliency and questioning about topic progression, and you can see that this is about foreseeing routines, predicting sequences of events and ideas. Arguments tend to follow a stereotyped thing, you know, rules of threes and so forth, and you give the main idea and then the details and all that. So learning to anticipate that is increasing a kind of automaticity with argumentation that is very helpful to being able to process while you're capturing. And eventually this leads to being able to predict test questions and also monitor for whether something makes sense. Sometimes that's difficult for our kids. They'll write something down and not stop to ask, wait, did that actually make sense? You're getting there. Knowing what you need to know to complete a task through the relevance and reference. So these are things that I distinguish, right? What's the topic is about is the relevance. What goes with it. Reference is what do I have that refers to that topic. So this is beginning to think about resource use. And there are some of the ways that that develops. And what we're trying to do is make it so that students will be efficient and effective note users and able to form questions from the notes that they have that the questions can actually answer. That's one of the things, notice that in producing one of the main idea questions on your note-taking experience this morning is it matters that you're producing a question the notes can answer as opposed to something entirely different. Shortening the message has to do with compressing the input, streamlining your capture, noticing that arguments are structured logically and that you can anticipate the progression of them, pulling out take-homes and so forth. You can see how it develops, and predicting the trajectory of an argument is a kind of automaticity in itself that kids can learn through note-taking. We get to the last two, summarizing and paraphrasing. So summarizing is reporting arguments, discerning what's essential, and constructing a gist. I would argue that we ask kids to give the gist of something before they're ready for it. Getting the gist is actually a late emerging skill, and it takes a lot of experience with figuring out what's important enough to be part of that gist. So we shouldn't ask for it too early. It begins with accurate quotation, relevant reporting, and especially there's a deletion part of getting the gist. What do I leave out? So if we spend a lot of time with capture, we're thinking about what goes in, but what goes out is a very important piece to processing that we would like you to consider. And ultimately what this leads to is the expression of complex thoughts in fewer words, getting to be succinct and to the point. And finally, that leads us to paraphrasing. So that has to do with pulling from your notes selectively, expanding upon the gist that you've gotten through the summarization phase in a coherent way, and transforming the message to suit a definite purpose that may be different from the one given in the lecture itself. It develops by learning to access resources independently. We really want kids to be able to do that, practicing summarizing frequently, and reporting and commenting on the personal reconstruction of an argument, which is ultimately saying, interpret faithfully in your own words. Notice that in your own words comes at the end of all this. So asking kids too early, put this in your own words, I would argue, is not doing justice to what they may be able to do. Students may not have their own words yet until we teach them how to get them, and that's what the paraphrasing piece is about. So keeping your eye on the ball is important. Now, you may be sitting thinking, okay, that's good, I'm doing these things already, and that's great. What you should do is make your thinking about these things visible. In other words, make apparent to your students what your reasoning is, why you're doing these things, and what you're aiming toward, and be very targeted, very disciplined in targeting sub-skills specifically and discreetly. A final Proviso, every kid is different. As you know, they develop as mosaics, not as trajectories. So this is an approximate thing, and I think a bottom line for it is don't ask for too much too soon. We may tend to do that and be disappointed by what students are actually able to do. It may take them longer than we admit, so let's admit it takes longer. And that leads us to Victoria.
All right, I know some of you guys are kind of itching to get to your next session, so I'll keep this brief, but I do want to take just a few minutes to make a quick note about what it is that we do for our kids that are still struggling, no matter what the support we're giving them, all of the strategies, all of the accommodations. What do we do to help them? So I want to just make a quick plug about assistive technology. Some of you guys in the room might be familiar with different types of assistive technology. These are ones that can be used for note-taking. You might be familiar with the LiveScribe pen, voice memo, Evernote taker, or audio note taker. I'm not really sure what you guys have at your schools, but using assistive technology is going to be very beneficial for our students who have working memory deficits, processing speed issues, and other benefits like the spelling, attention, and visual issues that kind of go above and beyond where we're meeting them currently with note-taking. So what we're doing, this is just an example of a program that I use with students, not selling anything, I'm not going to name it. But what we're doing is we're relieving the burden of the capture part. Because what we think is important, hopefully what we've convinced you guys is important, is that processing and applying is really what we're trying to get students to do. So if you have students where they're just really not succeeding with getting the capture down and it's becoming to the point that they are not then able to process and apply, provide them with some assistive technology, relieve that burden. It's not cheating, it's not a get out of jail free card. They're still processing and doing things in their own way. And that's just a very brief note about assistive technology. I could go much longer about it if I had time, so if you have questions, come and find me. But I would love to get to the summary.
All right. So that was quick on assistive tech. Whoa. I'm losing a microphone thing here. All right. So just as a summary for you guys, just to understand that we believe that you know, we often in classrooms we'll tell kids just take notes. You know how to do it. We expect when they get to high school, they know how to take notes. And in reality, that is probably not the case. Kids don't just know how to take notes or use them. We think it's important work to actually scaffold using notes. We think it's important work to actually scaffold those skills and that learning progression up to take notes. And it's complex and it's hard, and you guys are amazing at what you do. Use CPA to scaffold note-taking as an explicit skill with higher thinking. This is our push for you guys to adopt it to your pedagogy, your classrooms. You'll know what works for you and your kids, but just getting that idea that it's not good enough just to say, take notes, study for the test, but actually how to break those notes down and use them. And then again, scaffold other skills to support receiving auditory information. We want to thank you for coming today. If you have any questions, please come up and talk to us. If anyone wants to ask a quick question or two on the microphone that gets recorded, you're more than welcome to. All right, thank you.